one thing that I always am curious about, and I've talked about this question with other people in similar roles to yourself who advise on institutional plans, is but who also understand the idea of diversification the way that we all espouse it. They all they have risk parity, global risk parity mandates somehow in the alts bucket, right? And yet, to me, that is kind of the foundational core to any portfolio. Like if you espouse the idea of diversification as pursuing diversity and pursuing balance, that's kind of where you start, right? And then as you add elements to the portfolio, you're continuing to just add new diversifiers and continue to add them in a way that preserves maximum portfolio balance, right? So walk me through why many consulting arms and many institutions think about risk parity as an alt, and then how we can begin to change people's minds and bring them more on track.
Yeah, I mean, at least within our group, at Makita, we don't think of risk parity as a line item, right? It is a strategic asset allocation. It's a framework to invest your strategic asset allocation. Now, I've definitely seen risk parity strategies as sort of line items broken out separately across asset allocations. Now, I mean, I think that just comes down to, it's just so different than the conventional way of thinking about how to do your strategic asset allocation. And it gets back to like, what is the risk neutral position of where you sit, at least from an optics standpoint. Again, I go back to the kind of corporate pension plan example. Your risk neutral position is to be 100% investment grade corporate bonds, so you can minimize that funded status volatility and lower that tracking error.
Yeah, no, you're right. And we've got to sort of separate that out, because of course you're going to have people that view the liability in a very different way, right? So from an actuarial standpoint, I totally get that. But if you're thinking about kind of a foundation or an endowment or maybe even a public plan where you're not really held to liabilities, but rather you're held to a kind of a expected target return. How did these guys think about it, and why haven't they been able to kind of get closer to risk parity as the core?
Yeah, no, I think within ENF, their risk neutral position, right, is their spending plus inflation. So there you probably have more latitude to be a bit more intellectually curious about your strategic asset allocation. On the public plan side, their discount rate is pretty much using whatever their asset allocation is, right? So, I mean,
yeah, but I mean, you can meet a target discount rate with a risk parity portfolio too, with an appropriate level of leverage. So, I don't think that's
leverage, right? You just said it. It's leverage, right? People are adverse to the type of leverage that is used in risk parity, even though they're exposed to similar types of leverage.
Leverage everywhere, right?
Exactly.
Levered bonds. You're buying levered bonds. Why would we lever into bonds right now, right? That idea is what's really got. I think it's the ultimate. Yeah.
Well, risk parity is just equities combined with levered bonds, right?
That's right.
Yeah. That's what Rodrigo triggered.
Dude, I can't even. No, I can't even.
I don't even know like where that came from, because ever since I learned about risk parity, I always thought about it in terms of rates, credit,
where
equities,
I think
commodities.
Where I think it came from. I was thinking about this. Okay, remember that paper that Cliff, out of all people, wrote, or maybe it wasn't Cliff, it was AQR, that talked about 60-40 portfolio or equities, and they levered the 60-40 in order to match the volatility of equities, and showed how it performed. It outperformed equities with lower drawdowns, right? And that one was a simple enough paper that I think went viral. And then he also had his risk parity funds, and I think it just got conflated.
No, I think it was just most people articulate risk parity. They sort of go from a 60-40 portfolio, if you use risk goggles, is 95% equity risk and 5% rates risk or duration risk, right? And so you communicate it this way, right? Because it's a really simple way to articulate the concept. And then I think people just don't move on to the fact that, besides the fact that you want to hold everything in proper balance so that their unique personalities can show through, you also want to hold diverse investments. And that includes commodities and break-evens it's, factor exposures, et cetera, right? So they just kind of stop too early in the presentation or in the talk or in the paper.
We're all guilty of that, by the way, right?
Oh, yeah,
it's
we've
this
done it.
this problem of being like, how do we keep it
Bridgewater
as simple as
articulated that way
possible,
too.
right?
Yeah.
Well, you get these two asset classes, or you have, what was the example I used to use? A scale, right? You have two spheres that you put on a scale, and when you think they're going to weigh the same thing, but because they look the same, but in reality, one's made out of metal, one's made out of wood, right? That's equities. This is bonds. You can't do a scale analogy with a third scale. That becomes that. Now you break minds. So maybe it's a combination of all those things, right?
And it could be too, commodities are maybe a bit tougher for investors to grasp since it's in the, not in the kind of physical, it's in the futures market, right? And people get scared when you start talking about futures.
Mm-hmm. And I think commodities, rightfully so, when they look at any single commodity, it doesn't seem to have a positive risk premium, right? Yeah. So there's this, okay, you're getting paid on bonds, you're getting paid dividends on equities, right? What are you getting in commodities? And this is, again, what I think, we talked a lot about our paper, the optimal commodities paper, where, Adam went through the different sectors and securities and how do you weight them appropriately and then rebalance to actually manufacture a positive risk premium in the commodity space, right? Which ended up being something like 4%, Adam. I can't remember what the actual number was, but it rivaled. 4%, I think, yeah. It rivaled the equity risk premium, not by any sort of carry strategy, but simply from rebalancing. So
it rivaled the global equity risk premium, not the U.S. one, which is an outlier, but the global,
which is impossible to beat. Yeah. So I think that one is also a problematic thing, right? There's no value. Who would own commodities, right? So it requires much more education, I guess, to not only introduce that third leg of the stool, but then explain all these other layers as to why it's important to own them and why there's a positive risk premium long term and so on.
And it gets back to I think the bane of our existence, right? The old tracking error benchmark risk thing, right? Because it's like, well, if I'm doing risk parity, what's my benchmark?
Well, yeah, or like
the economic value of your liabilities that's your benchmark, right?
Yeah, I mean that's why I argue. Like, what is the absolute return that you need to achieve in order to meet your objective, and how can you do that in a least risky, fashion?